hats of different colored beads, such as they wear here, or little baskets for sale, whilst others were walking about alone, or conversing in groups. This is the first prison I ever visited, therefore I can compare it with no other, but the system must be wrong which makes no distinctions between different degrees of crime. These men are the same four cats whom we daily see in chains watering the Alameda or Paseo, or mending the streets. Several hundreds of prisoners escaped from the Acordada in the time of the pronunciamiento, probably the worst amongst them, yet half the city appears to be here now. We were shown the row of cells for criminals whom it is necessary to keep in solitary confinement, on account of disorderly behaviour, also the apartments of the directors. In passing downstairs we came upon a group of dirty-looking soldiers busily engaged in playing at cards. The alcalde, who was showing us through the jail, dispersed them all in a great rage, which I suspected was partly assumed for our edification. We then went into the chapel, which we had seen from above, and which is handsome and well kept. In the sacristy is a horrid and appropriate image of the bad thief. We were also shown a small room off the chapel, with a confessional, where the criminal condemned to die spends the 3 days preceding his execution with a padre chosen for that purpose. What horrid confessions, what lamentations and despair that small dark chamber must have witnessed! There is nothing in it but an altar, a crucifix, and a bench. I think the custom is a very humane one. We felt glad to leave this place of crimes, and to return to the fresh air. The following day we went to visit San Hipólito, the insane hospital for men, accompanied by the director, a fine old gentleman who has been a great deal abroad, and who looks like a French marquis of the ancient regime. I was astonished on entering at the sweet and solitary beauty of the large stone courts, with orange trees and pomegranates now in full blossom, and the large fountains of beautifully clear water. There must be something soothing in such a scene to the senses of the most unfortunate of God's creatures. They were sauntering about, quiet and for the most part sad, some stretched out under the trees, and others gazing on the fountain, all apparently very much under the control of the administrador, who was formerly a monk, this San Hipólito being a dissolved convent of that order. The system of giving occupation to the insane is not yet introduced here. On entering, we saw rather a distinguished looking, tall, and well-dressed gentleman, whom we concluded to be a stranger, who had come to see the establishment like ourselves. We were therefore somewhat startled when he advanced towards us with long strides, and in an authoritative voice shouted out, "Do you know who I am? I am the deliverer of Guatemala." The administrador told us he had just been taken up, was a Frenchman, and in a state of furious excitement. He continued making a tremendous noise, and the other madmen seemed quite ashamed of him. One unhappy looking creature, with a pale melancholy face, and his arms stretched out above his head, was embracing a pillar, and when asked what he was doing, replied that he was making sugar. We were led into the dining hall, a long airy apartment, provided with benches and tables, and from thence into a most splendid kitchen, high, vaulted, and receiving air from above, a kitchen that might have graced the castle of some feudal baron, and looked as if it would most surely last as long as men shall eat and cooks endure. Monks of San Hipólito! How many a smoking dinner, what viands, steaming and savoury, must have issued from this noblest of kitchens to your refectory next door! The food for the present inmates, which 2 women were preparing, consisted of meat and vegetables, soup and sweet things, excellent meat, and well-dressed frijoles. A poor little boy, imbecile, deaf and dumb, was seated there cross-legged in a sort of wooden box, a pretty child, with a fine colour, but who has been in this state from his infancy. The women seemed very kind to him, and he had a placid, contented expression of face, but took no notice of us when we spoke to him. Strange and unsolvable problem, what ideas passed through the brain of that child! When we returned to the dining hall, the inmates of the asylum, to the number of 90 or 100, were all sitting at dinner, ranged quietly on the benches, eating with wooden spoons out of wooden bowls. The poor hero of Guatemala was seated at the lower end of the table, tolerably tranquil. He started up on seeing us and was beginning some furious explanations, but was prevented by his neighbor, who turned round with an air of great superiority, saying, "He's mad," at which the other smiled with an air of great contempt, and looking at us said, "He calls me mad." The man of the pillar was eyeing his soup with his arms, as before, extended above his head. The director desired him to eat his soup, upon which he slowly and reluctantly brought down one arm and ate a few spoonfuls. "How much sugar have you made today?" asked the director. 50,000 kingdoms, said the man. They showed us two men, of very good family, and one old gentleman, who did not come to dinner with the rest, but stood aloof in the courtyard with an air of great superiority. He had a cross upon his breast, and belongs to an old family. As we approached, he took off his hat and spoke to us very politely, and then turning to the director, "Y por fin," said he, "cuando saldré?" "When shall I leave this place?" "Very soon," said the director. "You may get your trunks ready." He bowed and appeared satisfied, but continued standing in the same place, his arms folded, and with the same wistful gaze as before. The director told us that the two great causes of madness here are love and drinking, mental and physical intoxication, that the insanity caused by the former is almost invariably incurable, whereas the victim of the latter generally recover, as is natural. The poor old gentleman with the cross owes the overthrow of his mind to the desertion of his mistress. We saw the chapel where a padre says mass to these poor creatures, the innocents, as they are called here. They do not enter the chapel for fear of their creating any disturbance, but kneel outside in front of the iron grating, and the administrador says it is astonishing how quiet and serious they appear during divine service. As we passed through the court, there was a man busily employed in hanging up various articles of little children's clothes, as if to dry them, little frocks and trousers, all the time speaking rapidly to himself and stopping every 2 minutes to take an immense draught of water from the fountain. His dinner was brought out to him, for he could not be prevailed on to sit down with the others, and he ate it in the same hurried way, dipping his bread in the fountain and talking all the time. The poor madman of the sugar kingdoms returned from dinner, and resumed his usual place at the pillar, standing with his arms above his head, and with the same melancholy and suffering expression of face. The director then showed us the room where the clothes were kept, the straw hats and coarse dresses, and the terrible strait waistcoats made of brown linen that look like coats with prodigiously long sleeves, and the botica, where the medicines are kept, and the secretary's room, where they preserve the mournful records of entry and death, though often of exit. All around the court are strong stone cells where the furious are confined. He took us into an empty one, where a Franciscan friar had been lodged. He had contrived to pull down part of the wall, and to make a large hole into his neighbour's cell adjoining. Fancy one madman seeing the head of another appear through a hole in his cell! The whole cell was covered with crosses of every description, drawn with a piece of coal. They had been obliged to remove him into another in the gallery above, where he had already begun a new work of destruction. I was afterwards told by the Padre P n, the confessor of condemned criminals, and who is of the same order as this insane monk, that this poor man had been a merchant, and had collected together about $40,000, with which he was travelling to Mexico, when he was attacked by robbers, who not only deprived him of all he possessed, but gave him some severe wounds on the head. When somewhat recovered, he renounced the world and took his vows in the convent of San Francisco. Shortly after, he became subject to attacks of insanity, and at last became so furious that the superior was obliged to request an order for his admission to San Hipólito. The director then led us to the gallery above, where are more cells, and the terrible cuarto negro, the black chamber. a dark round cell, about 12 feet in circumference, with merely a slit in the wall for the admission of air. The floor